time yet? Got 60 seconds. Does anyone do impressions? We can. We got time to kill. This is the place where I had to have the guys come and open up my my safe. And so if you've seen me at Impact or whatever, I always tell people, put a pair of underwear in the safe. That way on the last day, you've got to go to the safe and get your iPad and all your stuff out, right? Before you can leave. And the consolation prize is if you forget to do that, then you just know you've lost your iPad, you've lost your tech stuff. But you know that somewhere out there is a locksmith who's going to go to his grave wondering, right? You got all this high-tech stuff, and then there's a pair. It's like, how does this work? If I pull this string, does a garrote come out? You know, can I rappel down the building on this? You know, like call Q and find out what's the deal with these underwear. So that's your consolation prize, right? So this is the hotel I was at when I managed to lock my stuff in the safe. And I got a presentation coming up. I'm in between sessions. I got 10 minutes. So I called down to the front desk and I said, if you can please have somebody at my room. I said, I've got 10 minutes and I have to be back here to present, and I got my little clicker and everything in the safe. I need someone can open the safe, no problem. So I go running back to the room, and as I get there, there's two guys in the hall, they're talking, and I'm obviously in a hurry. So, you Mr. Wyatt? Yes, I am. I open the door, the two guys rush in, the guy does his thing, the magic up, you know, the safe pops open, and I start collecting my stuff. They head out the door. As the door closes, I hear, was that underwear? So now, you know, it's like when I see those two guys, it's like, one person that I ran into at Impact says, you know, I tried this. Very nice young lady comes up to me after the session and says, I tried this, but my client had a problem. I had emergency deploy in the middle of the week, and I still managed to lose. You know, I followed all your advice, and I still managed to lose all my stuff because I left it sitting in the safe. So it's not foolproof, but it does work. So thanks for coming. You know, last day of the session. I always appreciate that people show up the last session of the day, not last day of the session. It's been that kind of a day. I have this change as the only constant slide on all the security decks because I want to make sure that everybody realizes, you know, I have seen cheat sheets that have been 10 years old, people using the same security cheat sheet after 10 years. And things change. So you've got to go and update this stuff. So I've broken this down really into three categories, right? There's stuff that's broken by accident, stuff that's broken on purpose, and stuff that's really just sort of security theater. And there's a very nice little disclaimer here because I want to make sure the people at Hersley know I'm not suggesting that anybody at Hersley set out to break security. When I say stuff that's broken on purpose, what I mean is that if you open a PMR and you say, I can't secure my queue manager because of this, they will tell you it's working as designed. They're not going to deliver a fix for that for you. Right? It's just the way it is, open an RFE. And then security theater, well, it's kind of on us. Apparently a lot of us thought reverse DNS would be a good idea. and other stuff. So here's the stuff I got. If you don't see your favorite one in here, let me know. Really, this could be an all-day session. I tried to narrow it down to the ones that I trip over the most, and I tried to keep it under 10. Local run MQSC. This is kind of interesting. It used to be that you had to be MQM to run MQSC locally. And you know, IBM added some features to that to allow us to manage CCDT files and do some things for which you're not necessarily MQM when you execute it. So they took that out. But when it actually runs the authorization checks, it had been running as admin all this time, and it never needed to actually, you know, turn down anything because of authorization, because it was always MQM, right? Any authorization check you did would have succeeded. So when they took that away, what we ended up with is, if you ran run MQSC locally, you could do all sorts of stuff. You could. Did I actually list it out? I think I need a slide here. But the kind of stuff that you could do is you could list off authorization records. So if I'm an attacker and I want to know what the authorization records are. Those tell me all the queue names. They tell me all the user ID names. They tell me what you think those user IDs should be able to do to those queues. That's really, really good information for an attacker. So a lot of people ask, you know, I have some sort of a problem, and you're suggesting I do this that doesn't really seem related. An attacker would have to know all sorts of detailed information to exploit that. Resource enumeration is the very first thing that an attacker does. If you ever take an ethical hacking class, you know, they teach you a little bit about social engineering, and then resource enumeration is most of what you do. Once you know all the resources, then the flaws that you try and exploit are usually fairly well known. It's the resource enumeration part that's the tough part. And so that's where all the skill is. So this was actually fixed in 8005. If you try and do these commands with a local run MQSC, it now fails. So you actually have to be able to connect, display, you know, on the objects you're trying to enumerate. Unfortunately, remote, not so much. If you have a remote MQSC, which includes MQ Explorer, MQSCX, DMP MQ config, right? So all these things use MQSC commands. They put PCF commands on the command queue, and they do this over a channel. Now, if you're local, the queue manager has a different sort of authorization scheme, right? It used to be that if you were local and you wanted to change authorization records and you wanted to run setMQAuth, you have to be in the MQM group. If you want to change authorization records and you're not local, right, and you have access to PCF commands, the only thing you really need is set on the queue manager. And you can change authorization records. You don't have to be in the MQM group. So the remote authorizations and the local authorizations are completely different. And when I raised this as a defect, they said, no, that's not a defect, that's by design. The problem was, if the only thing that you had was connect and inquire on the queue manager, you could do display channel status, display queue status, display authorization records, display connections. It's just connect and inquire on the queue manager and access to the command queue. You could do all that. So this was opened as a PMR, and IBM fixed it in 8004. And this is what you could do, right? So all these commands before the fix, if it says no error, then you could do that command. After the fix, you get a 2035, except that some of these still have no error. So if you do a disk CHS, it'll print you the channel statuses. Nice. Now, okay, I'm missing a slide. It's supposed to go between these two. After the fix, you can no longer do dis q star. That now fails. If all you have is connect and inquire on the queue manager and display on the queue manager, you do dis q star, that fails. But if you do dis ql, works great. Dis qa, works great. Dis qr, dis qm, works great. Right? And when this was opened as a PMR, it was returned as working as designed. What? But I checked it as of 8005 and it's been fixed. So the person who opened the PMR told me that they told him to open an RFE. But as of 8005, it seems to be working. And all of this actually affects stuff prior to version 8. And so the remote PCF commands, you know, going back to, I think, 7.1, it affects those. Now, I haven't gotten as far as checking every single fix pack. I've actually got, you know, Pete talked about the VM problems he had today. I haven't quite got the problems that Pete had. I'm basically just trying to get a version of MQ at, you know, 800, 001, 002, 345, 7501, 752, and all the way up. And then I'm going to sit there and check every one of these all the way through. And then I'll update this and let you know. It turned out to be a little more tedious than I thought it was going to be because I thought it would have been fixed earlier. So those are the things that are kind of broken by accident. Obviously, if you find something with security and you open up a PMR and it gets fixed, that kind of falls into the broken by accident category. By definition, if it's fixable under a PMR, it's not going to stay there very long, and if it's known, it's been fixed as of this release. Right? But there are some things that we know about that aren't being fixed unless we demand it through an RFE or some other way. So those are the things where MQ's broken by design. Channel auth doesn't quite work the way you think in a lot of cases. So as an example, we're going to authorize a server-con channel using a user map. Check client is required, and we're going to map the MCA user. So my use case for this is, in my shop, nobody's in the MQM group. Right? You just got the MQM ID and nobody else. And the reason for that, among others, I've got a customer who understood that if your administrators are in the MQM group, it should be their very first primary group. When you look at their Etsy password record, it says MQM group, right? Not staff, an MQM group is secondary, it's MQM. But this violated their shop standards. So somewhere along the line, a Unix SA saw this and said, well, we're going to make these conformant. And he took all the MQ administrators and he put them in the staff group and he made MQM their secondary group. Now when MQ fails due to an over-authorization, it fails silently. So nobody knew that this had happened. And nobody thought to check. So by the time I show up 5 years later, they have 10,000 objects and entire queue managers authorized to staff. If you have a user ID in the shop, you are in staff. There are roughly 30,000 people who are authorized to do everything in the wire system. So I don't put people in the MQM group, I make them become MQM. And when we're using client tools, I usually set it up, using Roger's exit, to where I can say, okay, show me your certificate DN, show me your address you're coming from, show me the ID that you want to give me, and if you were doing password, show me the password, and I'll check all of those things and decide whether or not to allow the connection. Channel off came along and everyone said, oh, this is great. Cancel all our contracts with Roger, implement channel off. It doesn't work like that, right? You can't combine these records. So what happens in this case is that if I have check client required, I'm not necessarily going to get the ID that's signed in, right? I'm going to map it and I'll get MQM unless adopt CTX is set to yes, in which case I always get the ID that was authenticated. Now on a user map record, the user ID that I send in is the one that's authenticated. But on an IP address record, that's not providing a user ID. On an SSL peer map, I'm not providing a user ID. So if I can match the distinguished name in the SSL peer, or I can match the IP address or reverse DNS name, which is fairly easy to do, then I can be that user, right? Regardless of the fact that all I need is the ability to sign in. And the way that we discovered this is I got a customer who, we went through all the trouble of setting user ID and password authentication, and then come to find out that any Tom, Dick, and Harry could sign on as MQM. They just needed to hit the right channel auth rule. Okay, that wasn't what we intended. So if you have adopt CTX, all the mapping part of all the rules is totally ignored. You can fill it in if you want. You can put in any value you want. But if you run into adopt CTX yes, it's ignored. That is a queue manager global field that you probably don't want to turn on if you have applications you're connecting with JMS. Because how does your service account that has no password supply a password to get through the ID password sign-on? Yes?
But that Java application, you should be binding with a certificate, and it binds to a client channel that doesn't have check client required, it has check client optional.
We'll see that later. There's no possible way to have check client none and check client required.
That's
right?
true.
You can't uplift from none to required.
And optional is sufficient.
Yeah, we'll get to that. I have a slide for that. Neil is always thinking ahead. You don't want to play chess against Neil. So the result is that, if you actually look at your channel's MCA user, and you look at your mapping rule, and then you look at your channel status, you could find that the thing in the channel status has no relation whatsoever to your rule or your channel setting. And this, I get calls from people all the time. How is this possible? You adopt CTX yes. Yes, we do. So it's not necessarily intuitive that you adopt CTX on a mapping rule, totally ignores the mapping. So why have the rule? I still need it to filter those things. Right? If I'm using certificates, I need a rule. And it's a user map rule. And the mapping part is useless. Right? If I'm filtering by IP address or reverse DNS, I still need the rule that does that. And I go through the check client thing, and then the rule is useless because the mapping doesn't occur. Now, we can play around a little bit with check client optional, as you'll see, but you know, in some cases it's very difficult to get the optional to work. So this is a case where I've got somebody that wants to combine channel auth records. And the idea is, you know, we set the backstop record so that, you know, by default, unless I provision access, there is none. Thank you, Morag. She's not in here, but thank you, Morag. Then we come along and we say, okay, we'll do an SSL peer map. We'll take any common name as long as the OU is MQAdmin. Then we will force a login, and we will map the user ID to MQM. Now I've turned adopt_ctx to no, so that I can actually map the user. Right? The problem is, you only get one channel auth rule. If you're going to do mapping, there's a precedence. The SSL rule overrides the user rule. This rule never fires, ever, ever, ever. You can't combine them. If you feel like you want to combine them, renew your contract on Rogers exit. Because channel auth doesn't do it. Right? You get one mapping rule and one only. And it goes through and it finds the most specific rule. It looks at the different types of rule. If you have an address rule and a user rule and an SSL rule, guess what? The SSL rule wins. Okay? If you have a user ID and an IP address, the user ID wins. Otherwise, the IP address wins. And you can feel free to put 3 different kinds of rule that all match. But only one will ever fire. And this is, you know, I get more calls and emails about this, you know, because people who are used to using block IP and used to using MQAUSX are used to being able to actually validate all these different parameters meaningfully, right? And you can't. But now you can get close. If you're willing to turn on SSL and you use the address part of the thing, you can say map to an SSL peer that only comes from this address, and do an ID check, and then either map it or adopt the user from the ID check. But that's the only instance when you can do all 3. So let's say we take, I got an extra one. So let's say we get rid of the rule to do the user map. And we say, okay, I'm going to stick CN equals T Rob and do the SSL mapping instead. So we're just going to get rid of the user map rule. And instead of mapping this to, before we had mapped it to nobody because we thought another rule was going to come in and override it, now we actually have to map it to the value that we want. So this is good. And if we say adopt_ctx, the thing that ends up happening is that we'll get T Rob as the MCA user instead of MQM. If we say adopt_ctx, yes. And this, again, has been a sticking point, right? Because, you know, we play with the rules, we play with the adopt_ctx. There are cases where I really want to adopt the context, and then there are cases where I don't, but it's a global setting. So I get calls and emails on this all the time as well. It's like, okay, what's the solution? Well, the solution is then you have to have an SSL peer with an explicitly named distinguished name for each one of these people that you want to map or want to filter on. And of course, this is on a per channel basis. The problem that we were having with this, in some cases, where people were making the things that were difficult, like the SSL peer, would just map on the OU of MQAdmin so that we have something that accepts all the admins in the department, and then we have some other rule that's more specific. Well, that doesn't necessarily work. And the other thing that we found out was that rule was working on any channel you wanted, right? Because it was generic. So we basically said, if you're going to map, you know, if you're going to accept these things, accept these distinguished names in all cases, but we expect there is another rule that's going to actually determine which channel it can operate on. No, it was working across the board. And that's kind of the problem with the user map rules as well. If you let them be generic, they work across the board. That user ID can sign on to any server con. When you get into the business of trying to filter these down and get the level of detail you want, you have to be specific with the channel names and the filter names. You have to have a whole plethora of rules. You can't get by with a couple generic ones. You can't do like MQ authorizations where you say system.** and then have system admin command queue be more specific, right? That does not work. You get one and only rule, mapping rule, and that's it. So this works, except that when we set the .ctx yes, and we get something in MCA user that isn't reflected in either the channel definition or the rule, people want to know how that's there. Right? And the best call that I got was from somebody who was in the midst of an audit and couldn't explain this to the auditor, and put me on the phone to try and explain why that's okay. It was not an easy job convincing the auditor that, you know, some value that's not represented anywhere is okay. Where's my KDB? This was interesting. If you type gskit commands, and you just type part of the command, gskit is very, very forgiving about giving you the rest of the command. Run mqakm, -cert, enter. Here's all the things you can do with certs. Run mqakm, -cert, -list, enter. Here's all the things that you can do to list a cert. Run mqakm, -convert. Here's all the parms you need. You need the source database, you need the password, you need the target database and the file. Run mqakm, -convert, -db, dbname, -stashed, enter. No error. Okay, we'll try something else. File not found. Go look in the directory. Sure enough, KDB is gone. No error, no syntax error, no indication of any problem. KDB just disappeared. What it was doing was, it knew enough to know it was going to try and convert the KDB. So it took the KDB files and it made temp files out of them, and anticipating changing them, and then copying back. Except that once it realized that it was syntactically incorrect, it just gave up and deleted the temp files on the way out. So perfectly good KDB, irreplaceable keys, right, that we've maybe invested at the CA, right? So we spent however much we spend at the CA to get our personal certificate for our queue manager, and convert KDB, it craps out. So I reported this. IBM agreed, yeah, that's a problem. We'll fix that. So the next version, and this is, I'm pretty sure this is 8.0.04 or 5 this came out. Now, it's much better. You type run mqakm -db -convert, and you give it the source name, -stashed, and nothing else. What they did to fix this was it converts from the KDB to the KDB. It still does what it did before. It makes up some temp files, but then it just copies them to the same names that they had before. You'll see the timestamps update, right? So now you've got a brand new instance of your KDB. It is syntactically correct. It doesn't lose your files. Awesome. Now let's say that you don't type stashed, right? So you've got the password, for whatever reason you know the password. You just invented this thing, right? So you know the password. So you type convert KDB, and you leave the stashed off. It prompts you for a password. Since you didn't specify stashed, it assumes you don't want that file. So even the fixed version will blow away your stash file. If you go from a JKS to a KDB, you don't have a stashed password, right? So it's not blowing anything away. And it will create a stashed password for you if you want it to. And there's also the added benefit that if you wanted to, instead of running the thing to recreate the stash in the stash password command, you can convert your KDB to itself and specify -stashed. It will stash your password for you. So it seems that the fix was a bit of a kludge, but it does at least prevent you from blowing your KDB away, but only on recent versions, right? The advice is always back up your KDB if you're going to do maintenance on it. And this is especially true if you have a version older than 8.0.04 or 5. This is also true on the, because it's the gskit version, it's not MQ version. So whatever version of gskit that they updated with the latest fix back, there's an incremental point release there. The prior versions will blow away your KDB. So might be important, I don't know, those keys are irreplaceable. According to the, if you use a 4096-bit key length, the key space is larger than the number of atoms in the observable universe. That's pretty unique. I consider that irreplaceable. I don't know about you. You can have security, or you can have monitoring, but you can't have both. Been telling people for a long time, you need to secure the queue managers, right? All this admin access is available to the world, let's secure the queue managers. MQ is now provisioned, secure by default. Now you actually have to provision access for people, and by default it blocks administrators. So at the very least, people go out and they create two different profiles. There's the authentication and access path we use for administrators, and then there's everybody else. Now whether that everybody else is more granular or not, that's kind of an open question. But once we've done this, we'd like to know sometimes that if we get past intrusion prevention and we want to get into intrusion detection, we want to know if someone's trying to break in, we might want to turn on monitoring. Okay, sounds reasonable. If you turn on security and you force ordinary people to access MQ with low privileged user IDs, and you've turned on authorization events, you're going to get one, actually you're going to get 55 at a minimum, every time somebody goes onto Explorer and does disq star, and they don't have authorization to display the queues. We will spit out 55 authorization events. Now if I'm trying to turn on monitoring, the last thing that I want to do is get my operations people used to routinely deleting messages that have no value whatsoever. How are you going to tell the valid authorization events from the invalid ones when you're getting thousands of them a day? The first customer I ever told, I've been saying to everybody, don't allow people to access the queue manager's MQM. And we've got event monitoring, how come nobody uses it? Very first customer I ever had that turned on both of those things. I get a call the next week, we're being hacked, we're being hacked. Well, how do you know? We're getting 10,000 event messages a day. You go there and come to find out, no, that's our tooling. Now keep in mind, this was back in 2006, and we're still doing this. This is obviously broken by design, right? Or it would have been fixed under PMR at some point. But essentially what it is that either people aren't monitoring, or they're monitoring and routinely ignoring stuff, and would probably be unable to distinguish an actual attack if it were happening. Right? If you're used to dealing with this, 10,000 event messages, authorization errors a day, how are you going to tell when I try to break in? Right? It's useless. So essentially, turn off the events, or go back to IBM and say, hey, if somebody does disq star and they're not authorized to some queues, don't throw an authorization event for a generic display. Now, if they try and display some queue name that's very specific, they give me a fully qualified name, and that they can't access, then yeah, I want an authorization event. Right? But I don't want disq star, dischannel star, everything star, because what does Explorer do? Every time you open up a panel in Explorer, what does it do? Dis whatever that object is star. And if you don't have authorization to display that, we're just going to crank out authorization events left and right. If you turn on command event no display, that does not help. It only stops the command events, not the authorization events that are generated from the command. It would be really nice if that, included the authorization errors that went with it. At this point, we're to the point where it'd actually be better to have fewer authorization errors and lose some valid ones than it would be to have 10,000, 20,000 of them a day.
So would it be reasonable to address that by granting a minimal level of access like display on all of the objects, like Q star?
Well, right, except that
valid use.
part of the problem we'll see a little bit later is resource enumeration.
Yeah, and that enables it.
One of the things that we generally don't want to do, there's a principle called least privilege access. And if you look in PCI DSS or HIPAA or any of the security regimes, they'll tell you that you're responsible for accountability, least privileged access. Nobody should have more information about the system than they actually need to know to perform their jobs. Well, if I know every single channel name and queue name and object name, that's more than I need to know. I can never get that level of compliance with PCI or HIPAA or whatever as long as this is happening. Or actually I can, but then I just swamp my monitor, right? And my monitoring becomes useless. I can get this HIPAA compliance, the PCI compliance, but my monitoring is worthless. But this gets back to the first thing we concentrate on is intrusion prevention. We don't tend to spend a lot of time on intrusion detection, forensic capability after a breach, right? We don't really think ahead into those things. So if you're not really doing intrusion detection, you probably haven't noticed that this is going on. This is what I call the cat box crispy security model, a very hard crunchy outer shell and a soft gooey interior that by the time you get to the interior and all the problems with this model, it's about as palatable as an actual cat box crispy. Reverse DNS. Now we're into the stuff that's just kind of security theater. It was kind of funny because when I left in 2013, when I left IBM, Morag took over doing the security presentations for the conference. And as an IBMer, she's not allowed to say, certain disparaging things about the baby. The baby's not ugly. So she got up in front of the crowd and she said, T Rob says this feature is like a gun that only points at your foot, has a hair trigger, and is fully loaded. Thank you, Morag. Problems with reverse DNS. I don't know. It's actually been a while since Dan Kaminsky, broke the internet by revealing that DNS was badly broken. And we have alternatives to DNS that could be used, secure DNS, but it's not deployed widely. And if I go into, especially shops that I go into where there's been growth through acquisition. I've got one insurance company in particular that depending on where you are in the network, you get back a different IP address for the DNS name that you give it. Because they had servers named claims, right? All these different predecessor companies had a server named claims. So you type in claims, you get something different everywhere you go. And it's, it's to the point that they can't actually fix it. So I can basically go anywhere in the network, and I can make my queue manager look like something called claims. It's easy, right? So this idea of, well, it's really hard to spoof an IP address, yeah, there's some technical expertise needed to do some of this stuff. But what we're talking about in a lot of cases is, the SWIFT attack. The people who breached the Bank of the Philippines stole $81 million. The transactions that they put in were closer to $1 billion, but 90% of them got flagged and turned down. And the reason they got flagged and turned down was because in a lot of cases they misspelled the name of the customer, right? These are non-English speakers who were trying to hack $1 billion, and they misspelled the names on, 90% of the transactions they put through. I'm betting that with an $81 million payday, those people can hire a proofreader, right? So they're coming back, and they're sophisticated enough to, actually get in and manipulate transactions in real time. If we're trying to authenticate things by a DNS name, right, and I can go into the DNS and I can do DNS spoofing, I can poison the DNS cache, I can do DNS denial of service errors, I can intercept the DNS query and point that to a different DNS resolution. Right? There's a ton of ways. I mean, if you just if you go to, I think it's thoughtcrime.org, Moxie Marlinspike's website, and just look at all the stuff he has there, these tools have been around for 20 years, and most of them still work. This is trivial, right? If I'm actually, somebody told me one time that, our system will only allow this PC to claim this name. I said, okay, turn your PC off. He did. I turned mine on. I put his MAC address in, said to my PC, here's the MAC address to present to the network, and I signed on as him. This stuff is trivial. So RevDNS has never been a very good solution, and a lot of people are using this. They tell me like, well, all of our interactive users that have to sign in over the VPN, right? We need to be able to take their machine name and map it to their actual name. Except that when they're coming in over the VPN, it's an aggregate identity. They're all coming in through the same VPN exit point. So all of their machine names mapped to the same thing. So it becomes really easy to spoof a different one. Right? I can come in and tell you I'm me when I'm actually Roger, because I come in through the same exit point and the DNS resolves to the same place. So it's really bad. The other thing, of course, is in addition to the fact that it's porous and not a very good security tool, when it breaks badly. So if your internal system tries to do a DNS resolution on your business partner's machine, right, which when they go to connect to you, it will, and that path is through typically a firewall, the firewall doesn't have a DNS name. Now, depending on how it's natted, you could come up with an IP address that just doesn't resolve. And instead of actually coming back and saying there is no authoritative resolver for this, it just hangs. And if it's TCP and you haven't adjusted the timing, it hangs for 2 hours. Right? So people are like, oh, I turned this thing on and all of a sudden my queue manager won't connect to anything. Well, yeah, the TCP resolver is still hanging. I see 50 instances of it, right? Just hung. The other thing is that the connection that you're getting could come in from multiple interfaces. I've got a lot of customers who have redundant systems. Right? So they have redundant circuits. They've got a Sprint circuit, they've got a Verizon circuit. The thing that's connecting to them could come in from either one of these. It's NATed 3 or 4 different ways. Right? And what we keep finding out is that the reverse DNS isn't working because you can only have one pointer record. Right? So where does that pointer record go? Well, it doesn't go across all 4 of these possible interfaces. Right? So aggregate IDs don't work. Sometimes you get a situation where forward resolution works great, but reverse resolution doesn't because your shop doesn't do pointer records. And so now you have a thing where you've got to tell everybody, oh, now I need a pointer record. And the ability of this to work as a security control depends on the rigor and discipline of the people who are maintaining the pointer records who don't do it for anybody else in the shop. But we consider that to be security. It's theater. I haven't checked this lately, but in the original incarnation, every single connection request that the computer got, that the queue manager got, for any purpose, was reverse DNS checked. Right? And so you turn on reverse DNS, you have no channel rules, auth rules yet whatsoever that require it, and all of a sudden it starts doing these reverse lookups.
I think it still does for non-client connections because of the value that puts in the log, the machine name in the log and the IP address.
Yeah, so we'll try and resolve those names for error logging.
Yeah. Even for successful connections, except for clients.
But even if you have no channel auth rules, when you turn on reverse DNS, it will do that. Now this is the one I was telling you we were going to get to earlier. So I've got a use case where I want check client is none. And I've got another use case where I want check client required. And on the check client required, I want to actually map those users to MQM. The check client none is because the JMS and Java applications that are connecting, once upon a time, they wouldn't put any value in the user ID field at all. And so they were always connecting as MQM. And there was a whole rash of PMRs at IBM because IBM changed how this worked. The classes now make a very good faith attempt to figure out what your user ID and present that on the connection. So unless you do something to block that, you're going to have a user ID on the connection. Blocking that, do you use an exit if you need to do that, or do you do it at all? Right, so the only way I know to block that is to actually have an exit that goes in and blanks out those values. I actually have to blank out the MQCSP and the MQMD user, whatever the user ID is in the connection field. If you don't do that, your Java JMS stuff is going to present something, and if you have check client required, it needs to check something. And if these are service accounts where there's no password, sorry, right? Your Java client can't connect. So I've got customers that created a password. Okay, in order to make this work for interactive users, I now have to have an ini file somewhere in the file system that's got the user ID and password credentials for the service account that runs the wire system? Really? This is what we're supposed to do? That doesn't work either. So now I can set optional, and then I can have required on certain channels. But the optional is the thing that triggers if there's anything in that value, right? So if I want to set optional on some channels and required on others, then I need that exit or something that's going to go in and blank out those fields in the connection request from all my service accounts and things. And then I need to authenticate them with something like SSL or reverse DNS to make sure that they're actually my service, my applications coming in. So this has to do with the conauth, and we've gone over this a little bit, but the idea on this one was I want to adopt the user ID and password in some cases, but not others. So when I get an authorization check and the user ID and password have been validated, I'd like to take those and put them in the channel's MCA user. But it doesn't always work that way. As a matter of fact, this is one of the things I was testing just before I got here. I've got a VM, and I've got MQ Explorer running as MQM. And then in the MQ Explorer's connection properties, I put a different user ID and password, and I generate an authorization error. And the authorization error I get back has both those user IDs. It's got MQM in one, and the other one in the other ID in the other one. And it comes back and it tells me the MQ CSP is not authorized. MQM would be if it got through, but the MQ CSP wasn't. So I'm actually able to present two different IDs to the queue manager. What I still need to test is if the second ID has access, if it'll actually sign on and let me be MQM, right? Because the ID that I passed in actually has access. We saw something that suggested that at my current client. We had things that were running, and the ID that they were running at was not the ID of the service account. And we weren't able to map because they had done an ID password thing, and it should have adopted the credentials that they passed, but the credentials that they passed wrong. So either something happened where they were passing the wrong credentials and we couldn't figure that out, or MQ was doing something squirrely and I'm still working on that. But the point here is, if you're trying to use a combination of like certificates and ID password, we get back to adopt CTX being global. The RFE that I'd like to actually see IBM consider is adopt CTX would be a channel per channel parameter. We say, okay, on this channel, it's interactive users. We really, really need to adopt the user ID and password that they present. And on these other channels that are service account, let's not, right? Let's actually map the ID and map the user ID into the MCA user field. When I reported this, I basically said I got back that this is an RFE. Right? They're not going to make check client none and then uplift to check client required. That's not going to happen, or at least not without an RFE and a lot of votes.
I'm pretty sure there's already an RFE for that.
Yeah, because I think you had that problem. Josh McIver had that problem. Yeah, I've heard from several people that, and I get these emails all the time. It's like, oh, I'm trying to do this, and I can tell every time they're coming from where they had an exit that was able to parse multiple filters, and they're trying to replicate that in channel off. And I don't think IBM understood how the exits worked or the amount of functionality that we had, and the channel off stuff is actually fairly basic compared to what you get with the exits. So the other half of that is, let's say we want to do the SSL filtering, and we want to do user ID and password checking. Because as my current client, this is what they want to do, right? So it's user ID and password checking across the board. For administrators, we want to do SSL filtering. For certain applications, we want to do certificate filtering. So that's the scenario that they presented. And I can do a user map, but I can't do an SSL map. I can do an SSL map, but I can't do user map, right? The thing that they missed was that you get one or the other of these things. They're mutually exclusive. If you have the SSL mapping and it matches, that's the one you're going to get. The user map has no effect at all. So what you can do is you can actually specify the SSL rule, and you can specify the IP address in the SSL rule, and you can work it out so that the thing that's connecting has to authenticate with an ID and password, and then you can map that, but you can never do a generic one. I can never have something that says, let all the SSL come in that, it's my organization and the department is MQ admin, and then, we'll do some more fine-tuned stuff in these other rules. That can't happen.
But can't you just provide a dedicated client channel for your administrators to use that specifies an SSL peer in the channel definition?
Yeah. Yeah, that's,
problem.
Yes, but the problem is, how do you do revocation? Right? Since nobody turns on revocation checking, the way we do revocation is we have a blocking rule. Right? So now I have to have, if you have one of these rules, right, then it excludes you from having any of the other rules. So I can put SSL peer mapping on that says allow OU equals MQ admin, but at that point, when somebody leaves the company, no way to block them. Right? I can make channel rules for very specific.
But they've got to log in.
What's that?
You have adopt context no, and you have the map from the user ID. So they have to succeed with a login on the user ID, which has been removed from the directory that you're looking it up. So they'll fail on that, and they'll fail to connect.
So there's two different ways to consider this. One is the way it actually works, and the other is the way that I have to tell the auditor, right? If I have to give an audit proof that something is or isn't going to happen, the fact that I'm just have a wild card in my SSL peer is a problem for a lot of auditors.
Yeah.
Right? I have to be able to show that once I wildcard something, that I can then revoke it or blacklist it in some way. Right? Now, I have some possibility of doing that here, but you have to be very careful with the rules because, as we've seen, you get one and only one. So if I have an SSL rule that fires, I need to make sure that I have a completely specified DNS name that basically says map this distinguished name to star nobody on that, for that rule. So I can trace the auditor to a path that actually shows a denial of service, a denial of access. Right? If I can't trace that path to a denial of access, my auditor doesn't like me at all. He just has to take my word for it that it works the way I'm claiming. So the last one is the resource enumeration. Right? So there's a lot of times when we start talking about security, and I want to talk about defense in depth. Right? I get a lot of people who say, well, I've set up channel auth rules, so nobody can connect to my queue manager that's not supposed to. Why do I care, what they can get to on adjacent queue managers? Once they connect, they're authorized to stuff. I let them authorize. If they can get to a transmit queue and get to the adjacent queue manager, why do I care? They would need to know the names of all the objects on the adjacent queue manager. Guess what? MQ lets you do that, right? So the idea is, when we do defense in depth, we assume there's going to be a breach, right? And then you start asking questions like, if this node is breached, have I lost the whole network? Right? Or is it contained on just this node? And the way that I stop that breach from spreading throughout the network is I do things like, I don't let people coming into the queue manager have direct access to a transmit queue, because then they can address a message to anything on the remote queue manager. And if the remote queue manager doesn't have a decent MCA user, then messages are going to land on whatever they address it to. There's also ways, if I work it out right, if I put something in the dead letter queue, MQ, when it moves certain things back, it does so without an MCA user. Right? It actually moves certain things with no MCA user. It's like, okay, so I can cause things to happen that have no MCA user, and that message is going to be authenticated every time, or it's going to be accepted every time, authorized. If I want to, I can actually send queries for different queue names. If you're using structured data in your queue names, I've got a customer who has 4-character branch IDs, and if you want to know all the channels, all the branches that are actually out in the world, you can just try accessing the transmit queues with every possible combination of 4 digits. Right? So you run 10,000 queries through, you're going to get back about 9,000 2085s, and you're going to get back a whole bunch of 2035s saying that you're not authorized to that object. But now you know what it is. Right? You know the numbers of all the branches. Neil's giving me a goofy look.
Yeah, I think they've changed that. I think you get 2035 for all of them now.
Okay. I'll have to test that.
Yeah, I could be wrong, but I have a feeling that changed.
Okay. For clients or for PCF? Or for,
good question. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Because at this point, I'm talking about a hop away. So, I've got some sort of control on this queue manager, and now I'm trying to do resource enumeration, and it's easier typically around the queue manager, the adjacent queue managers, because they haven't been secured from the queue manager to queue manager channels. We assume that if we do a real good job of securing the client channels, I don't need to secure from the other queue manager. So I can send PCF commands over there in a lot of cases that do queries. Or I can send messages that are designed to go to land on certain queues that have very fast expiry and confirmation on arrival. So the message shows up, it lands on the queue, it disappears, the confirmation comes back to me. And so I have a lot of ways of actually testing and enumerating all this stuff. And MQ, it was designed to be easy for developers. It was not designed to be hard for attackers. Right? So resource enumeration is something that we can do fairly easily. If you're a legitimate user, so first of all, if your queue manager is breached, right, the objection that these people don't know my object names, if the queue manager is breached, they do. Right? So if we have that assumption, they do. But let's say they don't breach the queue manager. Let's just say we've used structured data and I have the ability to query it. And we know that I can type in dis CHS star, disql star, right? So I can see those things fairly easily if you've given me access to the command queue. And there are ways, if I have a client, that I can just try and open those objects and access them or inquire on them. If they're a legitimate user, so they're not an attacker, we've given them some legitimate access. If it's a JMS app, as a legitimate user, it has to be able to connect and inquire in the queue manager. Because your Java JMS classes, that's the first thing they do. When you connect, what do? I need to know the name of the queue manager because it might not be what you gave me in the CCDT file, or you may have just given me a blank. I need to know the name of this thing. I need to know what its dead letter queue is. I need to know its CCS ID. I need to know the max message length. The Java classes legitimately need to know those things. Right? They don't need to know your intergroup queuing ID, but they can get it. Right? If you're on Z, they can get all your intergroup queuing ID, the queue sharing group name. They don't really need to know your installation details, like your installation path. Right? Is this, have you give your path some nice human readable name when you did the install because you're using multiple installations of MQ? Oh, look, it must be using multiple installations. I can see the description and the path and the name of the installation that we're running, right? Because I can inquire in the queue manager. I can see the repository name, right? So I know what clusters the queue manager's in because I've got a repository name and a repository name list. If the thing that I'm connecting to is a repository, I now know that, right? And I know the names of the internal clusters if this thing's a gateway. I can't tell you how many customers I have that say, I want to offer, clustering to the outside world. Never do that, right? Then they say, okay, I want to offer clustering, the message comes in, it hits the gateway, it needs to be able to talk to the cluster. I'll make the gateway a repository. It's my most highly available thing that I have because it's public facing. No, don't do that, right? Because anybody can connect to it. Right? And I tell people, don't let outsiders use Java or JMS client to talk, only queue manager to queue manager connections. Oh, we could never do that. I can't force this business partner to buy a queue manager. Buy it for him. He made $10 billion last year. Buy him a queue manager. Buy him an appliance. Oh no, we can't do that. They have to be able to connect with client. Okay, this is what they can get. If I get your max channels, max handles, max uncommitted messages, I have a client, I can commit a denial of service. I just start putting that many things under. Now you probably, hopefully, is because it's a gateway, you've tuned to prevent me from opening up lots of channels and stuff, but you haven't tuned to keep me from doing uncommitted messages, and if that's a particularly high number, I'm going to max out your log files. Right? If I'm a little pissed off at you, I'm going to bring this queue manager down, probably with this stuff here. But I can also see all your event settings. You're not monitoring authorization events? Shame on you. Let me go start querying all these things. Legitimate connection knows whether or not the events are turned on. Queued pub sub. Does your queue manager have a queued pub sub turned on? You let me attach to it with a client, I can find that out. And if it is turned on, I know the exact name of the queue that does queued pub sub. And if I can put messages on that, I can publish on any topic. Any. Because the queued pub sub engine will pick any message up off of that queue and publish it to the topics that you tell it to. So if I have that, I can get just about anywhere in your topic tree. I can tell whether advanced message security is in use. And I can tell your adopt new MCA values. So if I'm trying to cause a denial of service and I know what your adopt new MCA values are, if I can find a hole in that, then I can find the thing I need to exploit to cause your listener to come down or cause your channels to hang. So there's a lot of information that a legitimate user doesn't actually use, but which they get access to because they have inquire on the queue manager. So all these people tell me all the time, well, they'd have to know a lot of information about us. If I have no information about your queue manager at all, other than that it's listening for TLS, I can connect to your TLS port, and it will send me its certificate and the signer chain that the certificate needs so that I can, accept the connection from it. Now, if you have mutual authentication turned off, that's all I need, right? I can accept your inbound connection to me. You got any server channels? You got any sender channels that I might be able to send my way? I can make that connection happen. If you've got a server channel, and I've got your SSL stuff, and mutual auth is not turned on, I can cause your server channel to connect to me. Neil's giving me the evil eye again. The only thing that I need if mutual auth is not turned on is to be able to trust your queue manager.
Yes.
Right? So I need to be able to initiate a connection back to me, and I need to trust the connection when it comes in.
Yes, you just create a request and they've got soon enough to have servers that are on.
Yep.
Yep.
So, and if I can spoof the DNS, I might even be able to do this with sender channels. I've demonstrated that at 2 clients so far. I could cause their sender channel to come to me. They don't have mutual authentication turned on, so I got an SSL channel from them. And then finally, I don't necessarily have access to, much on the queue manager, but at the very least, I've attached to your gateway queue manager with my client, and there's no business applications there, right? I'm going to send messages on a remote queue that goes somewhere else. Well, the queue manager is going to be at least kind enough to tell me the name of the transmit queue that the remote queue resolves to. And if that transmit queue is the name of your interior queue manager, then I know your interior queue manager. Right, this is why some people occasionally get calls where somebody goes, yeah, this is so-and-so, one of your new Unix SAs. Yeah, I got a problem with queue manager so-and-so. And the person on the other end of the line goes, oh, let me help you with that. That's how social engineering happens. All I need to know is the name of the queue manager in the adjacent node. Right? I can call a help desk. At Bank of America, it was 1-800-NCNB was the help desk, right? Because NCNB was the predecessor bank. So you dial 1-800-NCNB, and you get the person that would actually tell you what's going on with that queue manager. A lot of those support names are actually published quite widely. At Bank of America, they're published so widely that if you did, it was NCNB, if you changed if you changed it from 800 to 888, right, you got some site that was spoofing the bank, right? Because they get 1,000 calls a day, and somebody types in 888 instead of 800. That's how well published those numbers are. So, if your names have structured data, right, I can get some clues to that. And I can also do, if I can actually put things, once I know the name of the adjacent queue manager, if I have the ability to get onto that transmit queue directly. And again, I get a lot of pushback from customers. Don't let your inbound channel from your business partner put things directly to a transmit queue. Well, how do we route through the gateway? I'm sorry, you'll have to make a queue remote or queue alias for every single destination. It's legitimate. Well, that's a lot of work. Okay, sorry. In that case, once they resolve the name of the queue manager, they can put anything on your adjacent queue managers once they get the transmit queue name. And so what do we do? Well, we know that I can do disql, disqa, disq, all right. So I'll just drop those on your command queue. Now I have the names of all your objects on the adjacent queue manager. A lot of this stuff is fairly easily stopped. But it's detail-oriented, and the objection that it's a lot of work is true. Some of the stuff is a lot of work. What I typically do is I'll create a baseline for MQ. Every queue manager in my shop conforms to this baseline no matter what. Above the baseline are patterns. There's a pattern for repositories. There's a pattern for fast failover. Get really small queue depths. Here's a pattern for large messages. Right, so I have a number of patterns, and then above that I have applications. Down in this baseline layer is all the stuff that stops this. And if you automate it, it's not nearly as much work as it sounds. So I have scripts that go out and they check against the baseline. We've implemented this baseline. Is the as built different from the as specified? That's a problem. So we get no drift. In the shops that are using this, we get zero drift from the specification. And the specification has things like, well, if I define a new inbound channel and it doesn't have rules that prevent it from getting to the transmit queue, the specification is not conforming to our baseline. So it immediately shows up on a report. Make it easier, faster, cheaper, more reliable to do it the right way than the wrong way, and all of a sudden doing it the wrong way is the thing that's expensive. Right? But bearing that huge pile of risk that's unaccounted for and continues to accumulating over time, that's actually is, you know, we keep hearing in the news, that's very expensive. The average breach is, what did they say, $86 million or something like that is the average breach, cost of a breach now for a large corporation. For only 10, I'll fix it for you. Hell, I'll do it for 1, right? But that, you know, it's an outlier. It's a black swan. It'll never happen to us. A lot of people tell me our company's not that interesting. It's not about interest. Security and attacks are like water, right? The attacks are automated. They go out and they test and probe, and if there's porous a membrane in the security, they find it, right? The attacks flow, they find the level of least resistance, right? So all this stuff is automated. There are people that I've got servers, I've got my own domain. You know what's in my server logs, right? Occasionally it's one of you pulling up something on my blog, but you know, that's like 0.01% of what's in the server logs. What's in the server logs is repeated attempts to hack the server, right? And that's all they get, just constantly. And when somebody has a shared server plan, a shared hosting plan, and they sell you your own domain and website, they've actually factored that into the cost, right? Because they're gonna run a gigabyte or 2 of traffic a month at your domain of just people trying to break in, So I've got customers that have external facing MQ. Hey, somebody we don't recognize is connected to our queue manager. How did that happen? You've got port 1414 listening on the internet. How did it not happen? Right? So it's not a question of how interesting your company is, right? It's a question of how accessible these things are and whether or not you've taken the steps to close the holes off. I told the last session that it's kind of like, you know, you have to be a little more secure than your neighbor, right? And nobody's going to break into your house if your doors are locked and your neighbor keeps theirs unlocked, right? They're the one that's going to get hit. 2 weeks ago, I had someone break into my car because we left it unlocked, right? And we were the only house in the neighborhood that got broke into. A bunch of kids walking down the street. They planned for this. They're wearing gloves. I got surveillance video. They're wearing gloves. It's summertime. They're wearing long sleeve hoodies and long sleeve pants and gloves. And they're very methodical. 2 of them come up this side, they open the car, the other 2 keep going, they try and open the truck's locked, they go back to the car, and by the time the 2 people who tested the truck have gotten back to the car, they've decided there's nothing worthwhile, and they all walk away. It took them less than 15 seconds. But it only happened because I left the car unlocked. Right? The things that happen to us only happen because you left the queue manager unlocked. Now, there's never been a publicly reported breach of MQ. Some very irresponsible vendor, after the Heartland breach, wrote an article that said, Heartland has complex systems that they didn't change the defaults on a lot of them. Heartland has MQ. MQ is complex. And then they just sort of insinuated that and left it there. But there's never been any confirmation of that, right? So we don't know what happened in the Heartland attack. That's all privately held by Verizon and the Security Fire and all the people who did the post-breach investigation. But there's never been one of MQ. Now, do we know MQ's been breached? Abso-freaking-lutely, right? We see this all the time. And who's it breached? I got a call from somebody who is in a U.S. government, federal government law enforcement agency. Hey, we noticed a whole bunch of handles on our command queue. Turned out that their partners, the other agencies or whoever, could connect to their gateway queue manager and use MQ Explorer. Now, why would they do that? Right? This is a felony, right? But well-meaning people trying to get their job done realize that there's admin access available on the queue manager at this federal law enforcement agency, and they can't keep their channel up, they can't get their application messages back, so they just sign on and see what's wrong with it. And if it's something they can fix, they fix it themselves, and life is good, and everybody's happy. Right? It's a felony. It should never happen, but it happens all the time. At Bank of America, we had someone who did something very much like this. They said, you know, your web GUI is not giving me the information that I need, so we're going to build a dashboard. So they built their dashboard, and they used some sort of backdoor access, right? They're using administrative access they weren't supposed to have. And their dashboard was pulling messages out periodically, just sampling the messages that we're going through. The only problem was, as it's pulling these messages out, it's locking them under the browse cursor so that the real application skips it and gets the next one until they release it, and then it goes back in. So in the meeting where they were proudly showing off their dashboard to upper management, gets interrupted by the application people who say that this problem that they've been having with out-of-sequence messages is really nasty today. Right? Because they're demoing the dashboard to the VPs. So all those out-of-sequence messages, they're just hammering away. Look at this, we can tell this, we can tell this, we can tell this. Meanwhile, wires to the Fed are not going out the door. Right? So very well-meaning people will find these security holes, and in the attempt of doing their job, sometimes shoot you in the foot. So we know there have been breaches, and we know some of those breaches have been extremely costly. Reputation, costly, money costly, and in most cases it's people just doing their jobs. Now we suspect some of the things that I've found, you know, have actually been malicious, but if there's no intrusion detection, if there's no forensic logging, right, if you just throw away the log files and they roll over, and somebody pushes in a whole bunch of things that are going to generate enough log files to roll over, and your log file is not large. So there's all sorts of ways of covering those tracks. So I couldn't tell you whether the things that we reasonably think were malicious attacks were actually that. And the customers that have discovered that and tried to turn on things like monitoring, and tried to turn on things like channel auth, right? That's where I found all this stuff, right? The customers that actually said, oh, we need to do something about that, and they get to the next level, and then we find this stuff. So what I really want to do, the stuff that's a PMR, basically fixes itself. You report it, it's definitely broken, IBM fixes it, we're done. The stuff that is sort of broken by design, that's the stuff we got to open RFEs on, whatever. You know, if we say, look, here's my use case. You know, I've got queue managers, administrators that need to do this, I've got service accounts, I've got ordinary users. I don't have enough granularity in your channel auth to make this work. I don't have enough granularity in the client checking to make this work. Right, that's an RFE. The stuff that's security theater, I can't help you. Right? If people, you know, say reverse DNS is useful, you know, IBM's going to build it. I should point out that when IBM built the reverse DNS because of overwhelming customer demand, there's a few things that were on the table that they didn't do. Right? So it's not like these things don't have opportunity cost. When they put in reverse DNS, it was a fairly big thing to make it work the right way, to get the channel auth records, to do the precedence mapping, to do the matching on the DNS names, to account for the fact that the DNS pointer records forward and reverse resolution doesn't work the same way, and to try and make it fairly reliable in the event that you don't get an authoritative resolver. Right? So that's just the basics. And that took a lot of work, and that displaced a bunch of other good stuff. There's a lot of people, right? So this is not just me and the occasional client. There's a lot of people out there in the community who, when we find these security things, really drill down into them, right? And a lot of the PMRs I've mentioned haven't been mine, right? So at least one or two of those are Neil's. A couple of them are Peter's sitting in the back room. And then the people at IBM, I wanted to thank them because I don't think they get enough credit a lot of times for the hell that I put them through. Maybe you too, I don't know. I'm sure there's some IBMers that see an email and go, oh, T Rob again. Questions and answers. Roger, you really need to schedule this earlier in the day because this is too depressing of a session to have as the last thing of the day. You know?
What is our user? So one of the issues that you said you had was someone being moved from being primary MQN group to secondary MQN group and staff got access to it. So with my customers now, with current versions of MQ, I'm always requiring -OA.
Minus what?
-OA user on the create MQN, or you change, afterwards you change it. So the authorization is based on user ID rather than group for Unix.
Yeah.
So it sort of addresses part of that problem here that user ongoing, if they then moved out of MQN group, that user still has access if they shouldn't. But at least nobody else does.
Right. So yeah, using the user-based or principal-based auth, as they say in the Knowledge Center, the principal-based auth addresses that. It does, you know, every time you fix one thing, it unveils like another, you know, latent thing. Whether the thing it unveils is worse or not as bad is usually the decider, right? So the thing that this unveils is that, and it's not nearly as bad because it doesn't happen as often, and you can fix it with rigorous processes. My customer migrated the queue manager, right? They had a failover event, and the failover event didn't actually include the -OA user thing, right? So the thing came up in group mode, right? Because their process wasn't rigorous enough to actually capture this as a requirement. It's like, this solves the problem. This is now a requirement. We have the hard dependency on this, but the process is not rigorous enough to capture that. And you know, they said, you know, well, the problem is, you know, that our failover and migration process. And I said, no, your problem is process rigor. Right? It's a human problem. It is, you know, I can fix this by twiddling a couple bits. The situation that allows it to happen is a problem with human process and rigor. Right? So you know, they're not disciplined at the shop to be able to capture. This is the whole thing with persistent queues, right? I wrote a blog article that says there's no such thing as a persistent queue, right? If you create a dependency, because your business requirement usually has a dependency on the persistence of the message or not. So if you take that business requirement and you put it into a queue setting, then that business requirement is now fulfilled by an MQ admin who is not associated with the project, right? Who may be in an outsourcing team somewhere else who has no idea about the project. But we now have the hard dependency on the setting of that queue.
And not only that, but next week he gets a call about performance, so he changes the setting.
Yeah, yeah. Now I actually had somebody who they were losing messages, and he decided that it was because some of the messages were non-persistent. So he just went through and he globally changed all the queues to persistent, including the model queue that the broker used. Right? You can't create persistent, messages in a dynamic queue, right? So your model queues, if you try and set persistence on them, right, nothing works because you're trying to put the message into a dynamic queue, and the message is attempting to be persistent. The dynamic queue won't accept it, right? So he makes this change, and then they start having this seemingly unrelated problem. Right? They don't hook the two things up. It's like, oh yeah, all of our messages are now persistent. We're going to have the most reliable system ever. And the next day it's like, man, we're having some really nasty broker problems. And the interesting thing was, the things that were messed up were the broker's internal response queues. And what we discovered was that certain broker processes specify persistence of the message, and other ones of them took persistence as queue default. So it wasn't necessarily consistent. It depended on the flow and the things you were trying to do in the broker. So it was very context specific how it broke. And it was breaking like across the board.
So one more thing, if no one else has got any questions. Do you have any view of why...
We don't know whether anyone has any questions now. Does anyone other than Neil have a question? Sorry, go ahead.
Do we know why, when you create an object as a user, you are granted full access to that object?
Yeah, the theory is that if you can create the object, you should be able to do whatever you need to do with it, including deleting it. So when you create a temporary dynamic queue, if you can't access the queue you just created, it's kind of a problem.
Yep. So for temporary dynamics, I'll see that.
Yep.
But for any other queue, if I'm an administrator, I shouldn't be able to read messages from the queue. I'm an administrator for heaven's sake.
I didn't say it was a sensible policy. You asked, do we know why? Yes, that's why, right?
Right.
So we created this policy that this is how it works. There's a code path that everything goes through during creation that checks who created it, what type of object it is, and then issues the authorizations.
Yeah.
Now, could I take that code path and say, let's get rid of it and just apply it to dynamic queues? IBM's going to tell you that's a lot of engineering. Would it be worth doing from a security perspective? Absolutely. Because MQ is designed to be easy for developers and easier for attackers. Right? We can change one of these and not hurt the other one. The ability to create a dynamic queue and then have all the access I need to it, kind of need to do that right out of the box, right? You shouldn't actually need an authorization, right? If I give you authorizations to the dynamic queue, right, that's all you should need.
Yeah.
The fact that I take that authorization model and apply it across the board, it's always been a problem. And I create, every time you create the queue manager, you get all these authorization records for MQM. They're never accessed, right? We create them. Why? Because that policy, right? That policy says, I don't care who you are, when you create the object, I'm going to grant you an authorization record that gives you all access to it, even if you don't need it, because you're MQM.
So one of the things that I observed, I had a customer that used LDAP authentication rather than local Unix authentication, and it seems to go away. When you create objects, you don't get the LDAP-based stuff for MQM anymore. Because it's not there, I don't know why.
Okay.
It's an observation, I'm not confident that it's right, because I'm going back and retested it.
Okay.
But it might be something that's worth looking at. And a reason to use LDAP rather than PAM. Most of our try to use PAM because it's easier.
Well, the other thing is we need to understand the schema underneath that, right? Because if your native group and IDs are less than 12 characters, that's one thing. If you're mapping to an alternative identifier, that's another thing.
Yeah.
So we would need to understand the LDAP configuration. But this stuff is very porous. It's very deep and detailed. And one of the things that I kind of struggle with is I'll go on to a customer and I'll do something that we've been doing for a long time, and all of a sudden it breaks, right? And they'll be like, well, you're the MQ security guy. How come you didn't know that? Like, I'm sorry. You can imagine how many. I wrote a script one time, right? What I wanted to do is I wanted to take all of the reserved words in MQ and put them in my spell checker. So I wrote a script that would do dis channel or something like that, an incorrect dis channel command, and it would spit out all the attributes for channels. And the same thing for, so the first thing I did was like dis nothing, and it gave me all the object types. And then it captured those, and then did dis on those, and it gave me all the attributes for those. And then I basically took all that, and I generated a reserved word list for spell check. It was, I don't know how many pages long it was. It was huge, absolutely huge. And then, of course, Fixback came out and it changed. Right? So I did this, and like 6 days later, I'm getting spell check errors again. Why? Well, I applied a Fixback. The depth of this stuff, the ability to actually test all these different scenarios. And we're just talking about authorizations and con auths and channel auths and stuff like that. And then you throw LDAP into the mix and say, hey, it works differently if I use LDAP. Oh, shit, right? There's a whole other dimension that I need. Every test that I just ran, with the channel auths and everything else, now we basically need to set it up with LDAP and do that entire suite of tests again to find out if the behavior is the same or different. So it's, and this is why I got to that acknowledgement slide, right? Because you know, we have a lot of people in the community who, when we run into these problems, they really, really drill down into them, right? But we have a lot of people who, I got stuff to deliver, right? Just tell me what the workaround is, right? So they identify that there's a problem, and maybe I'll get an email from somebody one day and says, hey, I got a problem with this, and they identify it, but then they just sort of go on there, and if I can't recreate it, it's like, okay, I can't follow up. And even if I can recreate it, I don't have an IBM account number. I can't submit a PMR outside of a customer. You know, if I'm not on engagement, I can't submit a PMR. Right? So a lot of this stuff, I just kind of have to, hey, John Rumsey, guess what I found? You know, and then maybe it gets fixed, maybe it doesn't. But it's really a team effort. And I'm just sort of presenting here what a lot of other people have. You know, some of this is my original research, but I'd say probably 80% of this is other people. That chart. This is from a PMR that Josh MacGyver opened. Right? They put this in the PMR and sent him an email. He sent me a copy of the email, told me which PMR to look at. I copied it out of the email and put it up here. But this is IBM's writing. Right? This is theirs. And the path that it took to get to me was, you know, somebody did a fix, and you know, and so forth, and then finally it gets back to the customer, and the customer sends it to me, and then I deliver it to you. So it's a big team effort, and I really appreciate all the people who have the time to dig into this stuff. I don't disparage anybody who has got stuff to deliver, right? That's what we do. You know, for those who actually have that, and I think really in Neil's case, and I don't know about Peter, but I think in Neil's case, it's like he would really sort of, he would just perseverate on it, right? If he couldn't actually figure it out and fix it, right? He'd be sitting there going, no, I think if I gotta get back to work. All right.
Yep.
So,
untrue.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.